So, what is the greatest problem in the world? Is it climate change, or the terror of ISIS, or perhaps poverty and disease in the developing world? Well, all of those are of course tremendously important problems. Yet I want to argue that none of them is actually the most important problem in the world. Instead, the most important problem in the world is a problem underlying all of those problems, namely the problem of political irrationality, our failure to use reason and evidence in politics. This is the greatest problem because, as the philosopher Michael Huemer has put it, it prevents us from solving other problems, including climate change, including the terror of ISIS, and including poverty and disease in the developing world. For instance, many economists have criticized Western countries' foreign aid, which is intended to reduce poverty and disease in the developing world. And they have claimed that much of this is ineffective and that some of it may even be harmful. One example of that is the American food aid to the tiny Caribbean island Haiti, which has caused local rice production to plummet because farmers were outcompeted. But even though some forms of aid have been ineffective or even harmful, others have been very effective indeed. An example of that is the fight against malaria in sub-Saharan Africa. Some estimates, they say that you can save a life for as little as $3,500 if you spend them on bed nets which protect against malaria mosquitoes. Think about it, that's a remarkably low figure. But this raises the question, why is it that governments have poured vast resources into ineffective food aid programs when you could spend them so much more effectively on bed nets instead? Well, the reason is that we didn't really know which aid programs were effective and which weren't. We didn't do enough research on the effectiveness on aid programs, and the research that we did do wasn't rigorous enough. But all this has started to change in recent decades, which have seen the rise of the evidence-based policy movement, especially in the US and the UK. And this is in turn inspired by the evidence-based medicine movement, which is a movement in medicine which campaigns for the use of rigorous evidence. And in particular, these people have argued that we need to use experiments. They've argued that if you want to learn about the effectiveness of some treatment, you cannot just look at the group that happened to get the treatment from their local doctors and the group that didn't happen to get the treatment. Because these two groups might differ in other respects, which means that if the group that got the treatment recovers faster, then that might be due to those other factors just as well as to the treatment. So we can't really know what caused the recovery. So what we instead need to do is to set up an experiment where we made sure that the group that got the treatment and the group that didn't get the treatment are as similar as possible in all other respects. Because then we can be reasonably sure that if the group that got the treatment recovers faster, then that was thanks to the treatment. And this same technique, it can be used in policy as well, and is being used to a greater and greater extent in policy. And gradually we're phasing out ineffective aid programs, for instance. But it can also be used in other areas of policy, such as crime reduction. And on the back of these successes, the evidence-based policy movement has grown. It's become a bit of a buzzword, again, mostly in the US and the UK. And certainly it has improved the rigor of the civil service. But still, it should be emphasized that it hasn't quite transformed politics the way the evidence-based medicine movement has transformed medicine. So, for instance, when a famous British unit specializing in evidence-based policy, when they evaluated the impact they had had, they came to the conclusion that they had saved the British taxpayers £300 million during their first 5 years. Now, that's not a trivial sum, absolutely not. But compare it to the £700 billion that the British government spends each year, and you can't really say that it has transformed the politics. So why is that? Well, the problem is that evidence-based policy has mostly just affected one kind of question, namely those where the goals are relatively clear and agreed upon. So foreign aid is an example of that. So the goal is typically to reduce poverty or to reduce disease, and we just want to do it as effectively as possible. But most political issues aren't really like that. Instead, they are complex in the following sense. We have several different goals which we have to weigh against each other. And some people, they emphasize some of the goals, others emphasize other goals. So an example of that is redistribution of resources from the rich to the poor. Here, some people, they value economic equality. They obviously typically want more redistribution. Others, they value freedom from government interference. They typically want less less redistribution. So this means that we have no agreed goals against which to measure effectiveness. And as a result, the evidence-based policy movement hasn't had that much of an effect on these complex issues. But does this mean that we cannot use reason and evidence on complex issues? No, it doesn't. To look again at the question of redistribution of resources, some of the people who want more redistribution, they sometimes claim that more equal societies, they are happier and suffer from less crime and so on. Now, others, they deny that. But regardless of the outcome of this discussion, it's very clear that this has relevance for the issue of whether we should redistribute more. And how are we to find out? Well, obviously we want to look at the scientific evidence. But you can also use logical arguments when you discuss this question. You can look at the standard arguments for more redistribution, and you can try to show that some of these are actually fallacious or they contradict each other, so they cannot all be true at the same time. And this is the kind of arguments that political philosophers who theorize about a just society, they give this kind of arguments all the time. And they clearly do use reason when they do that. So clearly we can use both scientific evidence on the one hand and reason on the other. We can use reason and evidence on complex issues as well. And if we don't do that, but rather go with our gut feelings, then we will end up with policies that are both less just and less effective. So what can we then do to make sure that we get rational decisions on complex issues? Well, one thing that we can do is to look at political debates. Because political debates, they hold a very central position in our societies. We hold political debates in order to inform voters about the different candidates, the different parties, their policies, and their arguments for their policies. And this is very important because voters are the ultimate decision makers in a democracy. And it's important for them to have this information in order for them to make a rational decision. But what then do political debates look like in today's society? Well, look at the debates in the current American election campaign. There have been lots of lies and distortion of the truth from many of the candidates in many of the debates. And the situation isn't much better in many other countries. So this means that the voters don't really get reliable information from watching these debates. So what can we do to improve this? Well, one thing that we can do is to fact-check the politicians. And in fact, there is an increasing number of people doing exactly that. Independent fact-checking is growing in the US, especially in the US. And it's actually these independent fact-checkers who called out many of the lies and distortions of the truth from the politicians. And research shows that they actually do have an impact. If it weren't for the fact checkers, politicians would have lied even more than they do. But there are also other things we can do. One thing that we can do is to promote so-called election quizzes or party tests. I'm sure many of you have taken these. So these are online tests when you're given 20 to 30 questions on different policy issues, and then you're given an estimate of which parties you're closer to and which you're not so close to. So these are intended to help voters who want to make a decision on whom to vote for on the basis of the views on policies rather than on irrelevant criteria such as party leader charisma or something like that. So we see that there are actually lots of people working on the problem of political rationality, and in particular they're trying to help voters to make more rational decisions. And these are just two examples, there are many others. What we need to do is to bring these people together and to form a movement, as it were, a movement for political rationality. This is important both to muster enthusiasm but also to let everyone see how their contribution fits into the greater scheme of things. And very importantly, this movement cannot be a purely elite enterprise, such as the evidence-based policy movement mostly has been in the US and the UK. Because it is, as I said, the voters who are the ultimate decision makers in a democracy. So in order to make politics more rational, they must be on board. We must get everybody realize that we have to take joint responsibility for making politics more rational. And in fact, we've already started doing something like this in Sweden. Earlier this year, I co-founded the Swedish Network for Evidence-Based Policy together with a number of researchers and students. And we're using exactly the strategy that I've sketched in this talk. We're both trying to campaign for the use of more rigorous evidence in policy directly, but we're also trying to have an impact on political decision-making indirectly via increasing the standards of political debate and making the political culture more rational in general. Now, one objection that we often get, and which people who work on the problem of political irrationality in general often get, is that this is just impossible. Politics is inherently irrational, and you're just foolish and naive who try to improve it. That will never work out. And this objection is dangerous because it breeds hopelessness. People are never going to try to improve something if they think it's hopeless to do so. But I think that we shouldn't be quite so sure to think it's hopeless to improve political irrationality. Some things are actually going in the right direction. We're getting more fact-checking. These party tests are spreading from country to country. And also note that once a movement like this gets going, things can happen pretty fast. That's what happened with the evidence-based medicine movement, that evidence-based medicine became a meme, as it were, and then things took off, and medicine has been transformed in a quite short amount of time. But there is also another reason to work on the problem of political irrationality, besides the fact that we have reason for some, well, admittedly cautious optimism. And that is that we now need it more than ever. Technological progress brings us many wonderful things, but it also increases the risks, because the more potent the technology is, the greater the catastrophe will be if it's misused or if it malfunctions. And these risks include not only climate change and nuclear weapons, which most people know about, but also lesser known risks such as synthetic viruses or autonomous intelligent machines, which we lose control over. And to minimize these risks, we absolutely need to take the right political decisions. And for that, we need political rationality. So this means that anyone who cares deeply about humanity's future should seriously consider working on the problem of political irrationality, because it is, as I said, the most important problem there is. Thanks.